going back to what would I do differently now? I didn't go back for my 4th year of at UBC Music School. And if I had my time over again, like learning the piano better, I would have gone back. Only because, not that I wanted the diploma or anything like that, only because as a student, and those students that are watching, you are in your golden years right now. Embrace this time, especially if you're in a music program. Embrace it the best way you can and enjoy it and study, work your asses off. I'm allowed to say ass, good. And, because it's a very special time where you've got, you don't have the burden, not that they're burdens, but you don't have the responsibilities of families and mortgages. And, sure, you got to make the rent and you got to put food on the table, but you've got
only gets
freedom.
More expensive from there.
So embrace and enjoy that freedom to study and explore and hone your musical abilities while you can.
Welcome to the Vocal Lab. I'm Sarah Ramsey, and this show aims to pull back the curtain on the entertainment industry, where veterans give up-and-coming artists some of the information they wish they'd had when they were just starting out. Sort of a music industry primer, if you will. Welcome to the Vocal Lab. I'm thrilled today to have with me Hal Beckett. Hal is a renowned composer, conductor, and music producer who has spent over 3 decades shaping Western Canada's musical landscape. As the music director of the Vancouver Film Orchestra, Hal has composed and conducted for operatic, symphonic, film, TV, and multimedia projects. His impressive credits include conducting film scores for Universal and Lionsgate and providing orchestral services for Michael Bublé's Crazy Love album. Hal produced 100 and now this, I had 2 different numbers in 2 different places, 102 or 110 national anthems with the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra for the 2010 Winter Olympics in Whistler, BC. And his work has earned a Primetime Emmy nomination for Call of the Wild and numerous accolades, including Canadian Screen and Leo Awards. Inducted into the BC Entertainment Hall of Fame, Hal actively supports the arts community through SOCAN and the Screen Composers Guild of Canada and nurtures talent as an adjunct professor at UBC. Thanks for joining me today, Hal.
That was a nice intro. Thanks very much.
I'll send it to you later.
And I think it was 110 anthems because we had to record all these, I hit the mic, all these for every country that had signed up for the Olympics, whether they were going to participate or not. So I think it was 110, and we ended up with 102 for the actual game, something like that.
Got it. Yeah. That's a lot of national anthems.
It was a lot of research, and if you want stories about that, I've got them.
Yeah, well, I think I have a question in here about that, so we'll get there.
Yeah.
Let's start out. Do you want to tell us your story briefly for listeners who are just meeting you for the first time? Say a little bit about your journey and how you got where you are today.
Well, like a lot of people, I had piano lessons as a kid, and I was very interested in music and writing my own material. And thankfully, I've had a few teachers, mentors along the way that sort of took me under their wing. There was one gentleman when I lived in Halifax, I was still in high school. He was the conductor of the Atlantic Symphony, and he took me under his wing. And so I learned a lot from him. And I remember writing concert band arrangements for my high school concert band. And I had a good band teacher who, if I showed up on a Monday morning after working all weekend and, writing out all the parts and everything like this, he would let the band, play it through. So for the first time, I started to hear things that I'd worked on the piano and, harmonies and voicings and all these kinds of things. And then hearing them actually performed, even though it was a high school concert band, but hearing those things performed, it was like an uncanny feeling of excitement and awe. Yeah. And I had to keep feeding that. So that's sort of how that all started.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was in a band. We were, a basement band. We played some high school talent shows and stuff like that. Of course, we thought we were the greatest band in the world. When you're in a band at 16 years of age, you think it's the world's best. So
absolutely. Well, I think you have to think that when you're doing
but then I look now back at it and I go, God, what do we sound like? Yeah.
Well, I think that's a pretty special experience to have a teacher who is so supportive in such a formative stage where you're going to bring your arrangements in and they're going to put them in front of the concert band and let them play through your arrangements, because not everybody has that kind of a supportive. There are lots of people who do have their own version of,
right.
There was this teacher who made a big impact on me, but there's lots of kids who did not have that, who you just never know what impact it could have had.
Well, I would like to think, and I'm biased, of course, I would like to think that most music teachers will see the bright spark in their class. I hope.
Yeah.
And, and I hope to any music teachers out there, if you do see that spark, please nurture it as best you can. I was again, one more school story. When I was grade 12, I'd always be hanging out at the band room. That's where I lived. And, the band teacher he would see me hanging there, and it would be grade 9 band class. And he'd hand me the baton and say, "Can you take the class? I got a staff meeting." And all of a sudden I'm conducting it was grade 9 band.
Yeah.
But, what a thrill for me.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot doing that. One last little anecdote about that. I also remember, same band room, the math teacher coming on the intercom going, "Is Beckett down there? Send him to math class." So, so that was my life, living in the band room.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I would hope that music teachers are as supportive, but it was not my experience. My elementary and high school music teachers, both actually, were not. I was just very lucky that I happened to grow up in a musical family. So I got my musical experiences at home and outside of school. And I had enough awareness because of the family that I grew up in to know that the experience I was having at school had no bearing on my life.
Right.
But if that had been my only musical experience, I would never have had anything more to do with music ever. So it is not as universal as we would hope.
You came from such a musical family.
Yes.
I mean, your parents were amazing. People still talk about them, and they're an essential part of the music scene in Vancouver and Canada. I mean, it's really wonderful. I mean, I sang in the church choir, so I mean, and I love doing that. And played in bands after high school. I played in a band, and we toured all over British Columbia. But that was back in the days where clubs, unless it was an actual quote unquote discotheque, all the clubs had live bands.
Yeah.
And so there was always a bar or a club that needed bands every weekend. So, we got gigs all over the place. And but it was cover bands, and we did open up for a couple of reasonably big names. Smokey Robinson, I remember once was playing the Besitas. I remember Starvin' Marvin's, and we opened up for Heart. It was stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it sort of worked it out of my system, and I realized that I was a trumpet player and a keyboard player, so playing trumpet in a R&B cover band wasn't really gonna do it for me.
Well, here on the Vocal Lab, we aim to shine a light into the industry through the lens of what I know now that I wish I'd known then. So with that in mind, what do you wish you had known when you were just starting out?
I wish I had known something about how the music business worked, and I had no idea. And I never, I mentioned earlier about some mentorings. Well, all the mentorings that I had at that age were all in music and nothing to do with the music business. So I was totally green. And that has lived with me all my life, that I've always felt green about the actual business side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So even now, when business opportunities arise or things like that, I'm always thinking that I'm kind of just outside the loop and I don't really know what's going to go on with it. And it's only back from that deep-seated, I don't want to say angst is too strong a word, but, concern that I didn't really understand the business side.
Yeah.
And I didn't. Certainly when I owned recording studios and things like that, we were just in it for the studios. We didn't have any clue about how to run a business or how the music business worked. So that would be one thing. The other thing is, it's kind of a regret. I wish I had taken my piano lessons and piano study more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Because I made a decision early on that I didn't really care to be a performer, like a keyboard performer.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of didn't pursue studying the piano more.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I had my time over again, that's certainly one thing I would do is I would have studied piano and be more facile at the piano. Any of you watching this, if there's a documentary, the new John Williams documentary is out on Disney Plus. You have got to watch. I mean, John Williams is one of my idols, kind of thing. And when you hear about what he said he was like as a teenager, and how much he practices piano, and his early start in the business was as a pianist, and a very, very good pianist. But when you transition into composing, and that's your livelihood and your main thing, to having instant facility at the keyboard in any key and any mode, and being able to do that effortlessly.
Yeah.
I mean, I can do that, but I have to work at it.
Yeah.
It doesn't just, let's play that now in A flat. It's like, oh, okay. You know what I mean? So, but anyway, watch the John Williams documentary.
My brother just texted me about that, actually. And I mean, by the time this hits the air, it's going to be a little bit further down the line, but he just texted me and said, you have to watch that.
Yeah. I got to watch it again.
Yeah. So it's on my list, but I feel the same way because I can play piano, and I mean, I think I got to grade 3 Royal Conservatory. I did not get far in my fancy official, but I can play piano, and I can sit down and self-accompany, and I can read slowly, but that facility to just play all things in all keys, when I am figuring out music by ear, I always think in C.
Right.
Because it's easiest to think in C.
Mm-hmm.
I wish, and I believe that if I had better piano chops, that I would have an easier time thinking in different keys.
Right.
Because to me, in my brain, they're very tied together.
Right.
Because it is how I visualize music is on a keyboard rather than on a staff.
Right. And C is the easiest key to think in on a keyboard related.
Yeah.
Whereas a guitarist may say, well, A or E is easiest in guitar. But just like I said about keyboard, those of you who are guitarists, but sure, maybe you can play, 50 pop tunes on your guitar and, that sort of thing. But if you really want to expand your horizons and expand your ability as a musician and a composer and a player, really get the rudiments. Can you play all the scales and all the modes and, in different positions on the guitar, get that facility under your fingers so you don't have to think about that anymore. And it really elevates you a notch above when you don't have to struggle or think about that. And to comment on what you just said about thinking in the key of C, for instance, is a way to shift that thinking is think functionally.
Mm-hmm.
And because I had early training at the Royal Conservatory in Halifax, I was a music nerd, so I was really reading music theory books, and I still do, to be honest with you. reading the music theory books, it did I was able to train myself to think functionally.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'll think, 2-5-1 rather
Yes.
than, D minor, G, C. And so if you start to think functionally, then transposing different keys becomes a lot easier because you're thinking functionally.
And to be fair, I actually do think in numbers, but so for clarity, I do think in numbers, but if I'm trying to think in a key, it's
Right.
automatically
Fair
C.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of transpose it into whatever key it needs to be in.
Mm-hmm. Well, and sometimes a good mental exercise to force yourself to think in other keys.
Yeah.
It's like with me with score reading is, I know a lot of composers when they're writing for strings, they'll go, oh, well, I don't want to have to deal with alto clef because that's what viola's playing. And it's like, no, work in alto clef.
Yeah.
Teach yourself and force yourself to read alto clef and tenor clef. There's the two C clefs that are, and there's C clefs and other things like that. But don't wuss out and, let's put it in a bass clef or let's keep it all in treble clef. Work on it in alto clef. And again, just moves your level of understanding and functionality up a notch.
It was interesting. I sang in the Phoenix Chamber Choir for a few years, and my first year or two singing with them, I sang tenor, which range-wise is where I am happiest, frankly. But it was the only time I have sung in a situation where I was reading music and singing in that range. So it was the first time I was having to read in bass clef all the time. And that was a very interesting exercise for me because I'm capable of reading in bass clef, but I'm much slower than I am reading in treble clef because I just don't do it. And I got better at doing it. But
was that when Corlin was conducting the choir, or was that after Corlin?
No, it was when Graham was conducting the choir. So it was my dad was still in it the first year that I was in it. So that would have been, I think, around 2016, 2017-ish. Yeah. Yeah. So, it was after Court's time.
Corlin Hallberg was my professor at UBC. And he was, I don't know if I learned a lot of music from him, frankly, but he was very supportive, and he and I got along great. And UBC at the time had an electronic music lab.
Yeah.
And that's one way that I got into electronics and tape manipulation and all that sort of thing. He saw that I had an interest in it and literally tossed me, there's the key to the electronic lab, knock yourself out. Of course, didn't take me into the lab and say, this is this and this is this and this is how you do that. It was just like, there it is, go knock yourself out.
Yeah.
So my work there at when I was at UBC, which was after my time in the band, I started off in the electronic lab there, and I'd still played around with tape machines and all that stuff at home, but then that led into a job with the it's called a boothie, where I was running the recording booth at the music school. So now I had a job that as a student to record all the noon hour concerts, all the evening concerts. So that gave me my own studio. Really, because, there was a old Altec Lansing tube console there, which finally got upgraded. And I think partly of your dad's efforts to get a Neve in there.
Yeah.
And it was a funny story because they had budgeted for an 8-channel Neve desk to record the classical music concerts. And by the time the purchase order had gone through the university's, red tape, the price had gone up on the Neve, and they could only afford 7 channels. And of course, they couldn't go and get more money because it would be an approved budget. So it ended up being a 7-channel console, which was kind of funny. Anyway, but again, because I was now a boothie, running the booth at UBC. Make long story short, the guys at the technical department at CBC would constantly raid UBC music department. Especially people who were boothies to work at CBC. And that's how I started working at CBC for a while.
Interesting.
So it was an interesting path there.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the education piece for a second.
Sure.
Being in an industry that sees lots of different levels of education. I mean, the music industry as a whole, some of the players have no formal education whatsoever, and some are highly educated, formally educated. You were at the Halifax Conservatory of Music and then UBC, where you studied composition and electronic music, and you studied under Barry. How do you say the last name?
Barry Truax, who
is not how I would have pronounced that.
Well, he's at Simon Fraser. I'm sure he's retired now, but he was at the forefront of FM synthesis, which was designed by John Chowning at MIT. And everybody will know this under the Yamaha DX7 keyboard, which is now vintage, but at the time was like frequency modulation synthesis. And so Barry Truax was a, what's the best word? But he was a follower, or he was a proponent of FM synthesis.
Yeah.
And so that's what he was teaching up at Simon Fraser. We got computer time in the evenings on the psychology department's Hewlett-Packard PDP-11 mini computer. And when I say mini computer, it was in a huge, big frame. That was considered a mini computer. And so I would go up there twice a week by bus from UBC to Simon Fraser. Boy, I look back on it when I was nuts. But would go up there and spend the evening, 2 evenings a week, working on computer music synthesis up there. I mean, we literally booted up the computer with bootstraps, which was a punched tape.
Yeah.
That's where the word boot comes from. And you would have to put it through a boot reader, which would set the parameters of turning the computer on. That's how you started to work on the computer. You had to bootstrap it first. And the discs were like, I think if I remember, they were like 10 or 20 megabyte discs, which were this big with a big plastic housing over the top. And that was 20 megabytes. And every command you would set in to the computer system, you would do on the equivalent of like a teletype terminal.
Yeah.
Now, teletype, I mean, nobody knows what that is, but it's like a computer keyboard.
Yeah.
But it had dot matrix printer attached with it. So you would write in you'd type in one line of code, and the printer would go and print that out. And then you'd hear the result. And then you go, okay, well, you want to change another line, and you type that in. Then you'd hear the result. It was a very laborious process.
Yeah.
The trick of doing it properly, which took a lot of work, was figuring it out, all your coding, before you actually got time on the computer. And I worked at that very hard for about a year, and then realized that I would much prefer to squiggle little notes on staff paper on a manuscript than sit and figure out code and play around with ratios of carrier to modulators to make different sounds, using frequency modulation. Yeah. And but anyway, it was a great experience. I did a couple of quadraphonic pieces, tape pieces at the time.
Yeah.
I wrote the music, such as it was, for a performance of the Bacchae at Freddie Wood Theatre at UBC, which was, it was a quadraphonic music playback, but it was all sort of, avant-garde. I hate using the word experimental, but it was, avant-garde, aleatoric music.
Yeah.
I've got the tapes kicking around sometime. I should make them and transfer them and see what they sound like. And I'd probably go, oh my God.
So in terms of the impact that your education has had on your career as a whole, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because, I mean, most certainly you would not have become a conductor of an orchestra without a formal education in music. I think that's safe to say.
Yes. You've got to have you got to be able to read a score. You got to be able to read music. And I hope that's not an art form that dies. So I would implore anybody watching this who has got any interest in that to learn how to read music and learn how to write music. And even it's as simple as plunking notes out on a keyboard and then going, okay, what's that going to look like on the staff, and putting, the notes on a staff, and teach yourself how to do that. I don't know if they teach that at school even anymore. I mean, if you went to study at UBC Music, I think if you took a composition class, it might be taught, but I think the professors would expect you to be able to do it a little bit first.
I think you have to take theory classes. So I think notation is part and parcel of that. I think different programs have different entrance requirements for theory. And I think one of the conversations that I happen to have been privy to in the world of voice pedagogy that has been interesting and has opened my eyes in a different way is around theory entrance requirements in university programs, and the issue of access and privilege. And so having entrance requirements for theory that disqualify some people from being able to enter the program without there being a solution in place, like you can come to the program but you have to take this like theory course to catch up first or whatever. But there's a lot of people who have some natural competency for music, but because of their socioeconomic status have not had access to music education prior to that. And so they may not have had access to that theory. And so it's just been an interesting part of the discussion that had never occurred to me before, frankly.
Well, I understand where you're coming from, what you're saying there, but I would tend to be a little tougher with the situation, especially in this day and age where you've got the whole internet available on your phone. So if you're passionate about music, you can find it online. And there's a guy, Rick Bairstow, he's got podcasts he does on music theory. He's amazing. Have you ever looked at his stuff?
I have not.
Oh, you should take a look at his. He's great, and he analyzes famous pop tunes and all that kind of stuff, and gets right into the thick of harmonic analysis with things. So the information's out there.
Yeah.
But also another thing along the lines of what you're saying, getting accepted to a music school and not having a basic skill set, you're just going to be overwhelmed. When I teach my class at UBC, it's a fourth year level in grad class, and it's film music. Without getting into all the nitty gritty of that, but there is a third year prerequisite to get into that course. But I, as a professor, I had the ability to say, okay, well, we can waive that. And the times I've done that with students who I thought had potential or might benefit from it, they quickly got overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Because part of what I expected was, I said, you're going to write 30 seconds of music a week. And of course, they'd go, 30 seconds of music, that's easy. Well, on top of the rest of your course load. And when you get down to it, write 30 seconds of music every week. It can be daunting if you don't have the background to do it. You mentioned about conducting. I never did study conducting at university, but I did take a course in Saito conducting, and he's a Japanese gentleman who designed and built a very specific way of conducting. And it was prevalent, and he started out in Japan, but there were some major conductors who did learn that, Ozawa, I believe, and there's a number of other ones. And so I did study that more as an adult than earlier, but I was conducting a lot when I was young anyway.
Yeah.
Once I got bitten by the bug of that, I conducted the music, MUSOC, which is the Musical Theater Society at UBC. So I did a musical with them. And then once I started doing more film and television work, opportunities for conducting, certainly in the studio, came up many, many times. And so I became sort of the go-to guy to do that. And then later on, I had the pleasure of, conducting, West Coast Symphony, and we did a bunch of film music concerts and things like that, which I wouldn't mind doing again, actually.
Yeah.
A lot of work, a lot of prep.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't do it for the money.
So after university, you opened your own recording facility where you produced over 25 albums, including the seminal recordings of 5440, the Vancouver Chamber Singers, and one of the first pre-CD vinyl digital masters. I don't know what all those words mean put together. I'm going to get you to explain it in a second, though. In Canada, Jean Pichet's L'Ange,
which is angel. Yeah.
As Vancouver's post-production industry began to expand in 1989, you opened a fully digital 48-track facility with Synclavier disc editing systems, and you provided audio post-production services for more than 60 feature films and documentaries, as well as over 100 hours of episodic television. Clearly, I had to write that all down ahead of time because it was not going to come out of my mouth otherwise.
Well, you got to remember that everything you just said was probably over a 20-year span. Yeah. So it condensed down to 30 seconds. It sounds like a lot, but it was a natural progression of things. As I mentioned earlier, I did get a job at CBC radio. And they, that was back in the days when the CBC Radio Orchestra, which was the only recording orchestra in Canada, was happening. Those were wonderful days. I learned a lot. I absolutely loved working at CBC radio.
When would that have been?
That would have been late 78, 79, 80, in sort of in that range.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot there. Again, going back to what would I do differently now? I didn't go back for my fourth year of at UBC Music School. And if I had my time over again, like learning the piano better, I would have gone back. Only because, not that I wanted the diploma or anything like that, only because as a student, and those students that are watching, you are in your golden years right now. Embrace this time, especially if you're in a music program. Embrace it the best way you can and enjoy it and study, work your asses off. I'm allowed to say ass, good. And, because it's a very special time where you've got, you don't have the burden, not that they're burdens, but you don't have the responsibilities of families and mortgages. And, sure, you got to make the rent and you got to put food on the table, but you've got freedom. It only gets more
expensive from there.
So embrace and enjoy that freedom to study and explore and hone your musical abilities while you can. Because once you're off into the real world, you're trying to get a job, and all those kinds of pressures, you start settling down into things and all that sort of stuff. Those days, you're going to relish those days. Anyway, so I was at CBC, and I had a home studio with a partner at the house that we lived in. And so it finally got to the point where CBC was getting in the way, even though, if I wanted to look at it practically, giving up a good job, which it was, pay-wise and everything at the time, was dumb. But, I was very idealistic. And so, I quit and ran this studio for a number of years. And we ended up with taking over a facility on Pemberton, which was Sculptures and Sound, which was a 16-track studio, MCI desk. And we ran that for a number of years until the finance crunch mid-'80s, when bank rates were 18%. And we were catering to one of the poor segments of the market in the recording and music business, being, emerging artists and bands trying to make a go of it and trying to make albums. And of course, cash flow was terrible and blah, blah, blah. So that didn't really go very well. So we ended up having to close that studio. And thankfully, I was able to get back on at CBC. So I sort of went back there with kind of my tail between my legs, but, it was fall back and regroup. And then a friend of mine that I had met at UBC Music, he'd gone to Toronto and got his master's and came back to Vancouver and looked me up and said, "Hey, Hal, would you like to start a music production company?" And I went, "Oh, that's sure, why not?" kind of thing. And so that's how I started writing jingles and everything during the mid '80s. We just got going just before Expo '86 happened, so we managed to ride on your dad on Miles and GGRP's back there for a while because they were the music production company of choice for a lot of Expo stuff. That Supernatural, advertising campaign.
Supernatural BC, right?
Supernatural. Oh, it was great. Fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
I remember Hoot Gibson telling me the story about when they went to pitch that to the advertising agency for Expo '86.
Yeah.
They'd written it and I guess they rehearsed it or produced something in the studio.
Yeah.
But they got all the singers together and went into the boardroom with this group of singers. It was probably Phoenix Chamber Choir. Now I think back on it.
Would have been Little Mountain Singers.
Or
then,
Little Mountain
probably.
Singers, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, went into the boardroom and sang live for the board. Of course, they were bowled over with it. I mean, what a great idea.
Yeah.
It was, but anyway, so we did, we wrote jingles and production music and corporate videos and did all that sort of thing. And talk about honing your music writing abilities. Again, 30-second jingles.
Yes.
And getting, a cogent musical idea down quickly and properly. I always used to say the first bar was the hardest. People go, "Oh," I said, "after the first bar, it writes itself," kind of thing, being a little flippant about it. But, when you think about it, first bar, what does it do? It defines tempo. It defines music style. It defines the key. To a certain extent, it defines the kind of arrangement it's going to be in the, what kind of music it's going to be. So once you get past that first bar, the rest of it sort of just falls in.
Yeah.
So, So that went for quite a while until the studio that we had, we had taken over a studio on Seymour Street, right across from the Penthouse Cabaret, which I think is still there. And it was called Telesound. And it was like going back into the 1950s with all this old tube recording gear. Again, I said, I wish we'd taken lots of photos, but, we didn't have camera phones back in those days. But it was like going back into the 1950s with old film dubbers, 16 millimeter film dubbers, but a nice big old studio with a 1910 Steinway grand piano in it. And so we were very fortunate and to have that studio. And we ended up locking together my old 16 track, which I still had with a 24 track, and all with SymphonyCode, and had lots of fun.
Yeah.
Didn't make much money again, because we would pour the money back into the studio as always. Anyway, the building got sold, and because of a high-rise going up, which is there now. And the partner I had at the time, I wanted to continue, as you read in the bio there, I would continue with, because the film and television business was taking off in Vancouver. So I wanted to be part of that wave, and my partner had enough. So we parted amicably, and there was a studio at the time in Vancouver called Phoenix Studios, and it was associated with the Columbia School of Broadcasting, which was a private, school for recording. But this studio had like a Sony 3348 1-inch 48-track digital recorder, about a $400,000 tape machine at the time, and a beautiful vintage Neve console. And the studio was being used 2 nights a week to teach a recording course.
Oh my goodness.
And so I went to the owner of the school and said, hey, can I lease a studio from you?
Yeah.
And he says, as long as we can have 2 nights a week for the school, absolutely. So we made a deal, and I ran my production company out of there for I forget how many years now, 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah.
And that's when I got into synclaviers and post pros, which were hard disk recording systems. Very expensive. They're about $160,000 each at the time, back in 1990s money.
Yeah.
But we had 4 of those all in edit suites, and it was a huge amount of effort, huge tech job as well. And of course, by the time this was all happening, I was becoming more of a studio administrator than a composer, even though I was writing any chance I would get.
Well, and as the post-production market in Vancouver has rapidly expanded, your services grew to include not only composition, Call of the Wild, for which you garnered an outstanding main title Primetime Emmy nomination, Yvonne of the Yukon, YTV's highest rated series, and also orchestral contracting for many feature films, Keystone Entertainment's Spy Mate, ABC's Once Upon a Mattress, and music supervising and editing for film and television, The Chris Isaak Show, Bright Light Pictures feature The Long Weekend, Highlander the series, and Stephen King's Kingdom Hospital. And more recently, you've been composing for several cartoon series produced in Vancouver, in addition to writing scores for feature films, including They Wait and The Storm. You also, and so do you want to talk a little bit more about the film and TV work?
So the studio that I just mentioned, where we had all this expensive gear, and I was chasing payroll every week and all that sort of thing. Let's just say things transitioned because of another studio that opened into town, and I don't want to get into all the skullduggery that went on with that.
Fair enough.
But and when I look back on it now, it was probably the best thing that could have happened to me, although it was quite devastating at the time.
Yeah.
And so, but I had this huge skill set now, even though my studio had been usurped by another. And that's a nice way of putting it. But I knew how to do digital audio editing, which was a highly sought skill at that time.
Yeah.
I knew how to write music. I knew how to do orchestral recording sessions. I knew how to score music for television and for image. And so an opportunity came up with a producer that I had met, and they were working on a new series called Call of the Wild, and it was with Animal Planet, which was a new sub network or a sub broadcaster that had just opened up with A&E Network. And of course, they were looking for material, and their only mandate was, did it have animals in it?
Yeah.
So, and Call of the Wild was a natural thing. So I was able to somehow, and I don't quite know how I pulled it off, but convince them that I could score their television series. And so I started to work on that. And there was a little funny anecdote with that, because I had written a main title for them. I thought, well, they'd already started shooting, and I had seen some footage. And so I went and wrote this piece of music for.
Can you, just for people that don't know, will you explain what a main title is?
Main title is well, it can be different lengths, but in those days they were usually 30, 45 seconds long, and it was the intro of the show with the title of the show and the name of the principal actors. And most television shows back in those days would start with this 31 minute opener before getting into the body of the show.
Right.
That's not the modern style, of course, with the streaming services and all that sort of stuff, but that's what it was then. So I'd written this piece of music and played it for them, and they, oh, that's very nice, blah, blah, blah. And, but I was working on the show, working on the first episode. all of a sudden I'm in a music meeting and the producer says to me, Hal, we got to do something about a main title. Who should we hire to write the main title? And I'm sort of giving my head a shake going, I'm your composer, like you're, and then, and I just happened to have it in my briefcase. I had the CD that I'd made and I'd played it for him before, but I said, oh, well, I came up with this. He didn't remember.
Yeah.
Put it on the CD player, played this. He goes, oh, yeah, that'll work. It was like, first of all, he wasn't even thinking of me, like, Hal, help me. Who do we hire to do the main title? And within a minute, he goes, yeah, that'll work. I mean, that's how it happens sometimes.
Yeah.
Anyway, what happened with that is as we got closer to, getting into post-production, I said, look, this music is orchestral in style.
Mm-hmm.
We got to come up with an orchestra for this. And he goes, well, how much does it cost? That's all they really care about is the cost. And I think the budget was $18,000. I said, 18 grand. Right. Okay. So after a bit of hemming and hawing, they said, yeah, okay, we can do that. So all of a sudden I had like a 60-piece orchestra for 3 hours is all I had them for, because the idea of the 18 grand was to spend it on the orchestra for the main title.
Yeah.
So I had written all this other music that was part of the first episode and the second episode, which were joined together to make a movie and blah, blah. So I recorded it with the orchestra at the Warehouse Studios.
Yeah.
And conducted it, and it turned out great. And then lo and behold, about a year later, I'm getting ready to, this is another sort of side story, go on a documentary shoot with a friend of mine who's a documentary producer. And he said, hey, Hal, he phones me up one day and he goes, hey, Hal, you want to go up to Guayhanas, Queen Charlotte Islands, Guayhanas. Yeah. He says, I got to go up there for a shoot and I need a sound guy. And I said, yeah, even I got to stand there, hold a mic for a week, but I'm up in Guayhanas. It was fantastic trip of a lifetime. Anyway, as I'm packing to get ready for that, the phone rings and it's a composer friend of mine in LA. And he goes, Hal, congratulations. I'm going, what? He goes, you got an Emmy nomination. Well, I didn't even know it was, up for an Emmy or anything, but A&E Networks had put it forward because they were trying to promote their Animal Planet, division and all that sort of stuff. So lo and behold, to get nomination. So we go to figure out who else has been nominated, and it was the same year West Wing had started with Snuffy Walden's theme for that. And as soon as I heard it was West Wing, it was like, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to win it. Snuffy Walden's going to get it for West Wing. So it was like, it was great. Anyway. But
it's an honor just to be nominated.
It was just an honor. So anyway, it is a kind of a cute story. So let me finish it, I guess. So my wife, who was pregnant with our third child at the time, we go down to Los Angeles for the Emmy Awards.
Yeah.
And we're sitting in the audience. This is the technical Emmy Awards, right? It's not the big gala with all the stars, but we're sitting there, and it comes along to category for best main title. Lo and behold, up on the screen they put Call of the Wild, like my piece of music, in front of Hollywood, and I grab my wife's hand. I'm going, oh my God, like. Am I going to win this thing? Like thinking, all of a sudden I hadn't prepared a speech, nothing. I thought Snuffy Walden was going to get it.
Yeah. And
so it comes along for them to announce it, and they go, and the Emmy goes to Snuffy Walden for West Wing. And it was like, oh, thank God. It was almost like, because I had nothing prepared. Anyway, so that was a fun thing. One last little anecdote with that. We come back to Vancouver. I get a phone call from a daily producer at Global Television.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, Hal, blah, blah, blah. Like asking about the Emmy. And so I'm telling her a little bit of stories about this. And finally she goes, so did you win? And I went, no, I didn't. They lost out to, Snuffy Walden and West Wing. She goes, okay, thank you. Like, so it was like, and I don't know if she'll see this, but it was like a brought back right to reality real quick, right? The moment to shine was gone, but it was it was an honor to
Yeah.
be nominated, and that series, that writing that show really gave a good jump start to my career for scoring for television and for film.
Yeah.
You mentioned Yvonne of the Yukon, which was the first cartoon series I ever scored, and I loved that show.
Yeah.
Partially because it was my first, and secondly because it was the most ridiculous show you can imagine. It was the silliest, most ridiculous thing, and the guys who made the show, Sully and Blair Peters, they were totally off the wall, and and we got away with almost everything. I mean, Yvonne was loading up a trebuchet with moose patties and, having a war with moose patties. It's like, talk about Canadian content. But yeah, that show was a lot of fun. And I always loved Mickey Mousing the like cartoons, like the Bugs Bunny, Warner Brothers kind of stuff. Even though they call it Mickey Mousing, some of the best of it was like Carl Stalling, who did Bugs Bunny and stuff like that.
All the Looney Tunes stuff.
And so, every action is hit with a musical hit and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of work scoring like that. But I remember the hours and hours and days I worked on that first episode. And this is back with 3/4-inch tape machines shuttling.
Yeah.
It wasn't, there was a computer running a SMPTE MIDI box and things like that, and racks of synthesizers that were all plugged in with MIDI, and mixing console, everything analog. Is not, it was very little digital in those days, if any. And I only tell this long story because it was the first episode, and I invite Blair and Sully which were the cartoon makers, to my house to hear the first episode. And I'm literally sitting like this, like, oh my God, are they going to like what I've scored? And so I hit play, and we're watching it, and they start to laugh. And they laugh at every musical gag I put in there, and I'm finally going, oh. I'm not saying they didn't have notes, stuff they wanted me to adjust, but the fact that they just laughed along with all this crazy ass music that I wrote for it. And anyway, I loved writing that show, and it was a joy. What else did you say in there? You said something about the first digital release.
What did I say?
Jean Pichet, who is a electroacoustic composer from Quebec, he had written a piece of music called L'Ange. And it's kind of funny when you think of it, but he had done all this electroacoustic music on analog tape, but he wanted it to be mastered digitally because it was a very new thing. And his initial release was on vinyl. So we're going analog, digital, back to vinyl. He finally did CD on it, right? So, but back in those days, there was a device called a Sony, I think it was a PC601, and it was a converter box that took analog audio in, and you recorded the digital audio on a 3/4-inch analog video machine. So it's a helical scan video recorder rather than on analog tape. And so this is what that is referring to, is this mix we did of his electroacoustic piece of music and mixed it down to the digital master. So that was a big deal at the time, because nobody was doing this. And this box that Sony, the 601 box that Sony had built, there was only like half a dozen of them in existence, and it was a brand new thing. So
pretty cool. Well, and coming back to the film and TV stuff, I mean, you have a list of film and TV credits that is literally pages and pages long, spanning everything from Disney, Pixar, Universal to Netflix and Hallmark. And how does in the current landscape and with current gear that's available now, and when you're doing stuff like that now, how does writing for film and TV differ from just traditional orchestral writing for somebody that is a young person sort of coming into the industry that doesn't know the ins and outs of that? What's different about that?
Almost all scores today are written using a computer program, and are usually, and the term is mocked up using computer and electronic samples of orchestras. If you watch a John Williams documentary I alluded to earlier, John's probably the only person alive in film who still writes with pencil on paper. And most composers who know how to write pencil and paper, I'm sure, as I do, still go off to their piano and write sketches and thematic ideas and, musical ideas on paper in a sketch form. But we all go to the computer now, which locks up the music sequencer to picture. And I don't think I need to get into a description of how we do music spotting and all the technical stuff of that, but you're wanting to know how the music is realized. So first of all, you got to learn a music software.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of them, Logic and which is Apple now, and Cubase are the two most prevalent. The one I use is Digital Performer. It's an older one, still active and still being developed. And they're, you get in debates upon Digital Performer versus Cubase versus Logic, and everybody's got their own. Pro Tools is an audio editing and mixing and recording program, and has sequencing available. And I know a lot of people are using that sequencing, but it's not as deep into the sequencing software and detail work as these other three programs that I've mentioned. So you've got to learn one of those programs, and you got to have a computer that can handle it. So we're talking a little bit. We're certainly talking more than an iPad. You got to have at least a Mac Studio or equivalent in PC world. I think most people are using Macs. Or a laptop or the Mac Studio or something like that. So you've got to invest a bit of money in the computer, and they're faster and faster all the time. And then there's another investment in the music libraries, the sound libraries, I should say, sample libraries. And there's a lot of them out there. Spitfire is a good one to go to, and there's hundreds of them. I don't want to get into trying to pull a list out of my head, but having a full orchestral palette of all the string techniques, the pizzicato, collegno, legato, bowing, spiccato. There's all these techniques in string writing that you've got to learn. And then, of course, woodwinds and brass and percussion. And that's just the orchestra palette without getting into, virtual synthesizers, guitar programs. And the guitar programs are amazing these days. And still doesn't really sound like a real guitarist, but as a film or a media composer using programmed guitars as opposed to live guitars is you can change the key, you can change the tempo, you can change stuff on really quickly and easily, that if you've laboriously now played an intricate guitar part and recorded into your computer, and now the producer comes to you and say, oh, yeah, that's working, but it needs to be a little faster. It's like, what, I'm going to now re-record this or put it into some, audio algorithm, which is going to speed it up or slow it down. And even the good algorithms still sort of have artifacts and those kinds of things. So the way that I would work if I'm going to do live, and keeping with the guitar analogy, if I wanted real guitarists to come in on a session and record the guitar part, I would still write it with the sample guitars, get it approved, make sure everything's working. Okay. And just before I go to mix my music for the episode or for the movie, bring in the guitarist. Okay, let's do this for real. And now whatever we can add. And, I also want to mine the guitarist's innate ability and musicality to add stuff more than the samples can give me and more than my brain can give me. You know what I mean? when I go and try and sell a live orchestra, and let's go back to orchestra a minute. When I go and try to sell a live orchestra to a producer, one of the things I always say is, if I've got a 60-piece orchestra in the room, that's 60 musical brains, highly skilled, highly trained. They've made their life playing the violin, to use one instrument. You know, they're going to bring so much more to this recording we're going to do than just playing a note on a keyboard that's triggering a sample.
Yeah.
So that there's selling that aspect of it. A lot of producers who are non-musical, they have a hard time hearing the difference. And I must admit that a lot of the samples are getting so good that it is certainly to the layperson, hard to hear the difference. But I would challenge any musician to write something with samples, listen to it, go, yeah, it's working. Oh, this sounds great. And then if you have the luxury or the ability to now hear it in front of a live orchestra, you'll go, oh. Because it is night and day. The last orchestral job I did was with my own music was a year ago, and I had to jump through hoops with the producers to get them, not the local producers, they were great. I'm talking about the network producers, to cough up money for a live string section. And I had to actually come up with music. Oh, here's the MIDI version, the computer string version, and here's what the real string version sounds like, and send them a couple of samples like that. Of course, boy, I'm really going to malign this producer. I'm not going to mention any names, of course, no. But it's like, then the question came after they were sold on, okay, let's do live strings. Yes, here's the money for it. Then the worry came up, oh, well, it's going to sound different than what we've heard already and what we've approved already. It would be like, if you watch the John Williams thing again, you'll go that John's playing the piano for Steven Spielberg and singing this little bit. And, and even Spielberg mentions in the documentary, he goes, and I just have to trust John that the music's going to sound. And of course he does trust him, and it always sounds great. So you got to learn that software, invest the money in all the sample libraries. And that's an ongoing investment with time. And, there's lots of resources out there in the internet of finding, the base, a good solid base to start with of sample libraries. But, we're talking 5,000 at minimum, 10,000. I've probably got maybe 100,000 invested in that stuff. Years. Problem is with it, like any software, it goes obsolete after a while and something better comes along and all that sort of thing. What frustrates me about writing with the samples, and let's just take writing a cello line. Yeah. You imagine the line, you write the line, so you play it into the sequencer on the keyboard, a nice cello line, okay? There's the music. Your job as composer is now done. You've written a nice cello line. But you have to do now multiple passes on that cello line to adjust the volume, adjust the modulation, adjust the amount of vibrato, adjust the velocities, because each velocity level triggers a slightly different timbre on how the instrument's played. So at least being older or more old school, that's how I look at it. My job as a composer is done once I've written or played in the cello line. Now I'm being a music technologist, going in and fine tuning all this sort of stuff. Now, the big guys, the AAA guys like Zimmer and people like that, they've got an army of assistants who do the grunt work for them. I'm not saying they don't write the music. Yeah. They still do, but they want it arranged. They want it orchestrated. They want all these little details put in. It's directed to other assistants. So, because the composer's job, when you've got a music team working with you, is to get those cues approved, to write the music, get those cues approved so they can move on. and it's in the pipeline. That cue's doing, boom, it's over to the next guy who's doing the MIDI cleanup, who's doing the takedowns for orchestration, who's, getting the parts on page. It's a whole process that, gets done in a music department, which is a much bigger deal.
That is a piece that maybe just sort of the general public doesn't see, is how much as the production gets bigger, as the scope gets bigger, as the names get bigger, the teams get bigger too. It's not one guy doing all the things anymore. It's a village.
The challenge with the lower budget stuff is that, composers get hired to write, a made-for-television movie, a low budget, like a Hallmark. And I'm not maligning Hallmark movies. I've written a lot of them, but they are low budget, and the composer has to wear a lot of hats to do those. Besides writing the music, you've got to get them approved. There's often music editing that's involved. You've got to mix the music, and a lot of guys do all this themselves. Me, I prefer to, even though I'll do all my own programming because I don't have the budget on those things to hire assistants or MIDI orchestrators and things like that. But I've always had my engineer, Vince Renaud, mix all my music. And he's been, he and I worked together for 40 years. And, we've got unspoken, way of shorthand of working together. And so I just send all my music to him now, and he makes it sound way better than it sounds to me in my studio. He also mixes it in 5/1. Mm-hmm. A lot of composers, especially on the low budget stuff, are still delivering in stereo. And it's like, well, no, our final delivery to the network is in 5/1. So the music's got to be delivered in 5/1. And if you don't deliver the music in 5/1, the audio engineer or mixer who's mixing the whole movie, like dialogue, sound effects, and music, they're going to fake 5/1, which can work. And there's some mixing engineers out there who take very seriously and do a good job on that. But it's not the same as having mixing it in 5/1 yourself. Yeah. So again, that's another reason why I always would use Vince to mix my film scores.
And for those who don't know, 5/1, you're talking about Dolby.
5/1, left, center, right, stereo surrounds, and a dot one, which is a low frequency effects channel.
So it's quite vastly different than just mixing a stereo mix. So everyone's routine in the studio looks different. So when you're recording with a live orchestra, which I've had the honor of seeing you do a little bit when you were working with Marianas Trench. And it struck me in that session in particular that it was interesting because my perception of orchestral symphonic players, classical players, is that they play from the page, whereas pop rock musicians are a lot more comfortable playing stuff by ear. Mm-hmm. But it was quite interesting because I watched Josh in real time change lines and just sing them the line that he wanted them to sing. And they were very adaptable with that. And they did a beautiful job of picking that up. And I loved watching that because it was not what I expected out of an orchestral setting, frankly. It's not the experience I have ever seen before. And I've sung with it, like in a choral sense, I've sung with lots of symphonies before. But so do you want to just talk about your process in the studio and making a record from working with the artist or the client right through to working with the players and mostly with orchestra kind of angle. Yeah. Well, first of all, that comment you made about when Josh wanted to change a line or something like, and he sang it, part of that is to do with, frankly, the people that I hire for these sessions.
I hire people who love recording, love playing film scores, love playing on pop albums.
Yeah.
There are people, I have to say this delicately, who are professional musicians playing the VSO, et cetera, who don't really care to do that.
Yes.
And that's fine.
That's totally
so
fine.
Those people I don't usually hire for my sessions.
Right.
Again, I said it earlier too, with a violinist, for instance, who has spent their whole life perfecting their instrument and can play it beautifully. And this is what they do.
Yeah.
That's for them to hear a line and have somebody write it down. They can play it immediately. Because they're all excellent musicians.
Yeah.
They have to be. So, in a legit classical setting, that would never happen.
Of course it wouldn't.
Maybe if they were playing a new work,
Yeah.
a new modern work, and the composer heard something with the live orchestra for the first time and went, "Oh, no, change that," they would do that kind of thing. But one of the things of being in a film or a pop recording session is you got to be able to think on your feet and be able to move with it quickly. It's put on paper because this is what the orchestral musicians know how to do, and it's also to speed things along.
It's the quickest way.
Certainly when I'm doing pop records, I look at the stuff on the printed pages, the basis, the bass.
Yeah.
And I know that, especially working with Josh and when I work with other artists as well, I know that as soon as they hear things, they're going to want to start to
Fiddle.
fiddle things. And then it becomes a function of time and money because, you can fiddle all day long.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen video clips of Danny Elfman in his early days in the studio. And again, Oingo Boingo, pop musician, became very good film composer.
I didn't know that's where he had come from.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I mean, I know him as a film composer. I didn't know that he had come from Oingo Boingo.
Yeah. But in his early days, I mean, I think it's an apocryphal story so it's like when they was working on Pee-wee's Big Adventure, which was his first film, the first time working with Tim Burton, they literally went in the studio with virtually no score.
Really?
And then I think he realizes they were doing this. And I hope I'm not maligning the situation. Again, I've heard this third, fourth, fifth hand story, but, basically Elfman singing the lines.
Yeah.
And there's an orchestrator, arranger in the booth, and they're scribbling stuff down, and the cello players are trying to, and realizing it's a very laborious process. You can't really work like that, And as you know, there's also a lot of pop artists, certainly ones these days, or ones in the old days where you used to own their own recording studios. Mm-hmm. They would, they would just sit in the studio and play around and have them tape machine. I mean, I heard a story of Steve Miller doing, the Joker, and that's how he came up with the song. He's, in the studio playing around, and he's got his engineer just rolling tape after tape after tape, and then they start cutting it all together and making up songs like that. Not a very efficient way to work, or a cost-effective way to work. So I got off the track there a little bit. You were saying working with with an orchestra with a pop artist. Well, for instance, can I talk about working with Josh a bit?
Sure.
Because, I mean, and I'm not just blowing smoke here, boys and girls. Josh, I think Josh is a musical genius.
I agree with you.
And, he really thinks out everything he wants. And he also thinks about which instrument's going to play it. So when he hands a song to me to orchestrate, and he hands me the MIDI from all his instruments he's done, he has done literally, 90% of the work already. So my job is to basically do a takedown and make sure it's on a page in a classical standard format that the musicians can read without even thinking twice. Boom, 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 boom. One of the main things I have to do, and it's the trickiest part of what I have to do for Josh, for instance, is when you're dealing with strings, is figuring out first, second violins, violas, cellos, and bass. That's the usual split on a string section. But sometimes you can have divisi parts, multiple parts, and also multiple lines. And so often with Josh's work, we'll have, some sustained stuff. And then on a secondary pass, we'll have to do some ostinato stuff, which is moving lines and things like that. So figuring out how all that works together is what Josh expects me to figure out how all that's going to work. So, and I'm happy to do it. But sometimes with other artists, sometimes I get the equivalent of just block chords or a piano part that's supposed to be strings. And this doesn't happen with Josh. Let me hasten to add, but a piano part or just block parts. And it's like, strings are going to play that. Okay. Now I've got to figure out how to put that properly on the page for the strings. There's something with string writing and vocal writing called voice leading. You don't just want random notes, boop, 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 even though they may fit in the chord progression properly. You've got to give a line to a singer or to a violinist to play, which has some sort of connection and some sort of flow in the line. That's how you make music. It's not random notes.
No, because voice leading, to me, it's always about it making sense. When the next chord comes, it made sense from what happened before.
Absolutely.
And
so it's that alignment of the vertical structure of a chord to the horizontal line of the line, which in the old school word for that is counterpoint, on how that works horizontally.
Yeah.
And it's the craft of making the vertical and the horizontal, if I can speak spatially like that, making that work is what good orchestration is with vocal writing and with string writing and the other kind of orchestra, right? Big band writing. When you hear a big band chart with, you've got 4 basic sections, trumpets, trombones, saxes, and a rhythm section, and it's making all those parts work well, and with proper voice leading is the key for all of that. So when I'm asked to orchestrate something for a pop artist, that's what I try to do, is make that kind of voice leading work to make it sound as musical as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Usually there's MIDI mock-ups. What we do is mix minuses in the studio. So as we replace the MIDI computer parts with the live parts, we can then turn off the tracks that have got the the mock-ups on them.
Yeah.
So gradually we build the track with the real players.
Yeah.
We've also got the MIDI mock-ups to refer to in case there's a transcription error or a copying error or something like that. And sometimes there's issues with especially added note chords. Let's say you play a minor 6 chord, but you're thinking of the lines that go along with that, and all of a sudden there's a vertical clash because the line you wanted horizontally doesn't match, let's say, the minor 6 in the chord. And so it's sometimes rewriting those lines. Again, this doesn't happen with Josh. Because I know he'll probably watch it. So but it's making sure that those things line up properly with the harmony. And I think emerging songwriters run into this all the time, where they find that their horizontal line doesn't match their harmonic line. And it's often because, back to what I said earlier, you haven't learned all the chords properly on the guitar or all the voicings properly. So again, if you get that out of the way when you're younger, you won't run into those problems when you're older.
Yeah.
I don't know if I even answered your question, but
no,
you get me going. You can see it. I'll just keep blabbing.
Well, and what you were just talking about creating what did you call it? The music minus?
Mix minus.
Mix minus. So that brings up, and I've heard Josh refer to this. I've heard him tell the story, but in the pandemic, when you guys recorded for his solo record,
right? Mm-hmm.
And it was the tune that I sang on with him, Miles and Miles, the one that he wrote for
Beautiful
Dad.
song, yep.
But you guys, which is a beautiful song and a beautiful tribute to my dad, who was himself a phenomenal, in particular, phenomenal vocal arranger. His voice leading was beautiful and, all of that stuff. But you guys recorded that in the pandemic at a time when you couldn't have more than, I don't know how many people in a room, but it wasn't many.
We maxed at 10 people in the room at one. It was
spread very far apart.
And I don't even know if that was quote unquote legal at the time, but that's the restriction that we had to work with.
Yeah. And you guys built that.
We built it all up from that. I also did a film score at that same time. And I've actually got more memory of that because it was because unlike working on Josh's stuff where there's already bed tracks and all those intricate vocal parts and all that kind of stuff happening, when we record an orchestra film score, we're starting from nothing. I mean, yeah, there's mock-ups, but I mean, we're building an orchestra score, and we had to figure out how to do that. And we started off with cellos and basses. So all we recorded was cellos and basses. And then we recorded violas. And then we got in a string section and did second violins. And then with the same section, we recorded first violins. And that's how we built up the string section. And then we had to do the same thing with the brass and the woodwinds. Now, those of you who play or been around brass and woodwinds players, especially brass players, what are they doing? They're spitting into their instruments all the time. So we had all this issue at the time during COVID with all the sputum, and everybody was divided up with barriers, and
boxes.
We had towels on the floors for all the spit to go in, and it was a very, very nutty time.
Yeah.
But we got through it, and everybody had to be vaxxed. So I had a couple of musicians who were let's call them anti-vaxxers, and I'm not judging them, but that was their decision that they'd made. And I had to say, well, I'm sorry, I can't invite you to the session because everybody's got to be vaccinated. And I don't want to go through all that again.
Yes, don't miss those days.
And then, there were a lot of recordings that were done those times with people in different rooms all over the place. And we were all thinking at the time, God, is this the new paradigm? Is this how we're going to be doing this from here on in?
Yeah.
Thank God it went away as quickly as it came. But we don't know.
It was a weird time because it was in some ways a very prolific time for music because people had time to make music.
Correct.
But it also presented just these unique barriers in the process of recording the music. When we were talking ahead of this interview, you mentioned something that raised a question that I thought was worth touching on today. Do you want to talk about your thoughts about music and the music industry and the prevalence of AI and how those two intersect?
Sure. I've got some thoughts about AI, but I've got to preface whatever I'm going to say with this, that I haven't done a lot of research on AI. And the reason being is because of a fundamental belief that I have. First of all, I think AI is bad for music. Mm-hmm. However, saying that, I think there's some aspects of AI which we as musicians have been using for a long time. One of the earlier forms of sample and synthesis processing involved what was called sample modeling. And it was basically analyzing waveforms of acoustic instruments and then replicating those waveforms and their resultant harmonic series using synthesizers. So therefore, you could have a realistic sounding trombone, which was not a sample of a trombone, but sounded very real. And I never liked sample modeling instruments. I didn't like the sound of them, but fellow composers who I respect, who I've heard their mixes of orchestral music with sample modeling instruments in, I go, really? That's a sample modeled bass trombone? It sounds amazing. But when I'm dealing with the raw sample, I don't like it. So anyway, that's one aspect of AI that we're using. Composers are always taught to analyze music of the masters, and pop songwriters are always analyzing songs, the Beatles wrote or whoever wrote, and analyzing the chord progressions and the chord structure and the way the melody interacts with the chords. So in a sense, we do our own AI. The big difference is, though, that's a human brain, analyzing it and making up their own decisions, like embracing what's working for them as an artist and rejecting what's not working for them. So there's a whole algorithm, human algorithm, in that thought process of a human being, a human musician, versus to just a computer that's doing that.
Yeah.
Obviously, using AI to replicate music to replace working musicians is wrong. That's bad. I don't know what's going on with Spotify. I do not subscribe to Spotify, but the stories that I read about stuff on Spotify, and maybe I shouldn't malign stuff about Spotify on this. If you want to cut this out, do so. But
you're not the first person to speak their mind.
But there are lots of stories of AI generated tracks being saturated into the Spotify playlists, therefore robbing artists of streaming royalties, such as they are, and things like that. The upside of AI, or for composers and musicians going forward in the world of AI, is that, in my opinion, the skill set of writing music and performing music is still going to be needed, required, and part of human development, sociology, psychology, artistry going forward.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be a desire for the latest, greatest guitarist, vocal group, film composer, concert composer. So, and even if you embrace aspects of AI and think that that's something you want to explore yourself, it still needs the input that human artists and musicians need to put into AI.
Yeah.
So it's like anything. Don't use AI for evil. Use it for good, and use it for what it's good at. You know what I mean? I mean, it goes back to the Luddites and the looms, the steam-powered looms of industrial England, and how it did put a lot of people out of work, and it was the weavers, they put a lot of weavers out of the work, and it was a terrible thing because it was like versioning AI. It was all just dumped upon society without any thought of the social ramifications of it down the line.
Yeah.
Gradually, the issue of mechanized looms settled, but it took many, many decades before the working conditions were right, and the people who were weavers and things like that got jobs, proper jobs, running those things. And I don't know why I'm getting into a historical analysis weaving, but there you go.
I heard it.
Jacquard was one of the earliest computer programmers. The Jacquard plates that he would make with all the holes in it for the patterns in it.
Yeah.
That was the progeny of computer punch cards.
Really?
Back in the day.
I heard, and I'm trying to remember who it was. It was an actor, and I want to say it was possibly Michael Douglas, but I could be wrong about that. Tom Hanks. I don't know. It was somebody though. Talking about AI and what they sort of foresaw in the arts was that it would actually encourage audiences back to live performance.
I agree.
Because it was the one place within the arts, and same can be said whether it's music or whether it's theater or whatever, but it was the one place where you can trust that it's
real,
it's humans.
Yeah.
Is in live performance.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you there.
And I thought that was an interesting viewpoint and could be at least a benefit of.
My wife's always showing me cute little photo stuff on her phone.
Yeah.
And she'll find something, and I can't think of an example off the top of my head. And I'll look at it and go, oh, it's AI.
Yeah.
And she'll go, what? Some cute little dog thing or something like that, because she's a dog nut.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know how maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not AI, but it looks like it to me.
Yeah.
And then she's like, so with her eye, it's like, oh, she thought it might be real. Of course, she's getting a little more savvy about it now.
Yeah.
So, and we've got this problem in politics and government and all this kind of stuff going forward with AI.
Yeah.
You can look at the late night show hosts, Kimmel, for instance, who comes up with these funny videos skewering a politician and it's done with some sort of AI and computer graphics and all this sort of stuff. And you laugh at it, but you think, well, we know he's making a joke and we know it's not real, but how far away from the moment when something's going to break that everybody's going to think is real and it's not. And that's going to be a problem. Yeah. And you can see where the actors are coming from. Back to your acting comment is, there was a big controversy with Peter Cushing's family or estate. Now, Peter Cushing is Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars, and he was a mainstay of the Hammer movie studios back in the 50s and 60s, who did all those horror movies, Dracula, et cetera, and he was usually Van Helsing and stuff like that. And so, he's got a great pedigree in those kinds of movies. But after he passed away and Star Wars put him in the 7th or 8th or 9th movie, whatever it was, I guess they felt they had the right, or it was in a contract somewhere, they had the right to use his image. And it became a problem. I think it's got settled since then. And it's the same thing with using Carrie. Oh, I can't. Princess Leia. What's her last name? Carrie. Oh, come on.
Fisher.
Carrie Fisher. Carrie Fisher. But because they were aware that it was going to be a big deal, all that was settled out ahead of time before they reused or modified her imagery for that. But you can see why the actors are concerned.
Yeah.
It certainly is an issue in animation and things like that. It's even an issue with extras with actors where they'll shoot a block of, 50 extras in a scene and then cut and paste those 50, in a gladiator kind of Colosseum kind of thing. So those kinds of things are being worked out. But and I think some of them have been after the last actors strike. But
and voiceover actors that's a place where that's really coming to
and reusing stuff and all that sort of thing.
Well, and they're able to like feed a sample of an actor's voice in and have AI spit back out in
Right.
the voice of
Right.
and just reuse.
It's probably been done or
Oh, yeah.
being done with singing and all that kind
Yeah,
of stuff.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah. So that's something that's using AI for evil and not for good. So as long as I think that old adage of using it for good and not for evil, I think it's it's not going to get away from it. What's the biggest stock on the stock market right now is Nvidia, and they're primarily AI developing. So it's not going to go away. So embrace it for what it can do for you artistically, but don't use it for evil. There you go. I've said it 4 times now.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Hal. This has been really fun to sit and just talk about stuff.
Yeah. Well, thanks for allowing me to reminisce. I like it. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah. No,
and I think what you're doing is great. And I hope all you guys love what she's doing. So keep watching.
Thank you.
Okay.
And we'll put all the things in the show notes, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay. Thanks very much.